Greetings, everybody. Welcome back. Episode number 2 of our Redux course. I hope you've already watched the first episode. In the previous episode, we kind of created a simple slice. So we created the store and we also created a page, a component that could, help us add a new employee as well as listing the employees. So this is the notes that I've got here, and this is the project. I'm still on episode number 1 branch. So if we want to recap, we kind of created uh, a React project with Vite, right? And then we installed the dependency, right? We installed the dependency. I showed you the command, and then we created one slice for our entity employee. We've got this import. We've got our initial state, which is a list, like an empty array, let's say. And then we've got our slice, which currently has only one reducer. Reducer is the function that allows us to change the state. And of course, we've got our initial state, we've got the name of the slice, we've got the reducers, and then we are exporting the add employee, right, as the reducers or actions, and then we've got this default export here as well. And then we had our store here. We created a store using configure store that we imported here, right? And then we have this reducer object. We specify a key and the reducer or employees reducer, which we are importing from the slice. And then inside of our main.js or JSX, we are importing the store, we are importing the provider, and then we are wrapping the application with our provider component, setting the store like this, and then we have our component. And the component uses dispatch as a hook to dispatch actions, to dispatch, for example, add employee reducer with the ID and the name. So this, take a look here. We are, calling add employee, right? And we are passing in this object, right? The object has two, let's say, keys or properties, ID and name. And if you take a look at add employee here inside of our slice, add employee, it takes state as well as the action. And then here, using action.payload, which is that object that we pass to the add employee, we are going to take that payload. The payload is the object that we had in the component, the ID and the name of the employee, and we're going to push it to the list of the estate. The estate is this, right? So for add employee, we have the estate, we've got the action, we are using the estate, we are accessing the list, as you can see here, right? And we are pushing one element, which is the payload, passed through the, using this action parameter. Back to our component, you can see here that we are dispatching this add employee, right? We have this dispatch here. We have imported the add employee, right? And we have this employees, as you can see here, we are using this hook, use selector, to get the list or that array inside of that slice, employees, to get access to that list, right? And then we have a local state for the employee manager component that maintains the list of the name of the employee, the new employee that we want to add, and that state is used here in this input. Now, that was what we did in the previous episode. Now, in this episode, we want to have we want to add a new feature, right? The application needs to be able to edit an existing employee, and we're going to see how we can do this. So in episode 1, we kind of recapped what we did in episode 1. Now we want to have a new action called edit employee, right, inside of our slice. Currently, we have only one action called add employee, and then we're going to change the UI of the application, right? to allow us to not only add a new employee, but also edit an existing one. So the first step is to add the add employee to the slice. So here we've got our employee slice. Previously, we had this add employee, right? And now we are going to add this edit employee. So let's take a look at the edit. The edit, like the add employee, takes in the state and action. And then first, we need to find the index of the employee object inside of the list that corresponds with the ID of the employee that we want to edit. So the ID of the employee that we want to edit is inside the payload of our action. And then inside that payload, we've got one ID. So we're going to compare that ID with the employee ID with this, object that is passed to this arrow function. We're going to use find index on the list, which was the state, right? And the initial state, it was, an empty list. And this can help us to get the index of the employee that we want to edit. And then we're going to check whether that index exists. If it is not equal to -1, we're going to change the element at that index, right? The element inside of that list array at that specific index that we've found, and we're going to replace it with the action payload, which is of course the employee. So inside of the action.payload, we've got the employee. So that means that if we navigate to action.payload.id, we will get the ID of that employee, right? So of course, after that, we need to export edit employee, like exporting add employee. So I'm going to take you to Visual Studio, navigate to episode number 2, go to the slice, and this is the new edit employee. You can pause the video here and study the code. This is really important. I really want you to think about this. Using the action.payload, you can get access to the employee that is passed to this edit employee or add employee. And the state helps us to access the list that we maintain, the list of employees, the array, right? So each function, each reducer that you see here takes in 2 parameters, right? The state and action. Action helps us through the payload. We can access the object that is passed to the function, and state helps us to get access to this array, to this list. Now, that is what is happening here. And of course, as I told you, we need to add employee as well. Export add employee and edit employee from the slice, and then we will be able to use it. So these explanations that I just told you are, mentioned here as well. And this is a very good example. Take a look here for edit employee. It says receives an object with an ID and updated values. So it's going to be ID 123, and the name of the employee will be updated name. And then it finds the matching employee in the list using find index, right? And then it replaces the employee at that index with the updated object. This is exactly what is happening here, right? So now let's continue. Then we need to update the UI of the application, the employee manager. Previously, the employee manager only allowed us to add new employees. Now we want to change it so that it allows us not only to add new employees, but also to edit, existing employees. First off, the first step is to import this new function, edit employee, from our slice, right? So we import React and use React hooks to manage local state, of course. So we've got these 2 imports as before. We're going to use selector hook to access the Redux state. We're going to use dispatch to dispatch the actions like edit employee, add employee. And we're going to use these 2 action creators, edit employee and add employee, to kind of mutate our state. So this is the change that we need to have. The component, as you can see here, the component, as before, is going to access the array inside of the employees, state, employees.list, and it's going to use dispatch hook. This is the thing that we also did in the previous episode. So we pull the employees array from Redux using use selector. We get the dispatch function so we can trigger reducer Redux actions. Next, we create a local state for our component, name and set name. And then we create another local state. So this local state, we already had it. This is a new one. Set editing ID and editing ID. So, the purpose of this new state is that it tracks whether we're adding a new employee or editing an existing one. So if editing ID is null, it means we are adding a new employee. And when we are adding a new employee, no ID has been assigned yet, right? But when we are editing an existing employee, the ID will have a value. And the ID is called set editing ID. So based on the value inside of this, we can kind of decide whether we are in the middle of editing a new employee or adding a new one. And then we've got this new handler, right? So previously we had only one handler for handling add or adding a new employee. Right now we've got this new handler that handles not only add but also edit. First, it's gonna check the name. The name which is inside that local state. It's gonna trim it if it is like white space. If it doesn't contain any meaningful characters, it's gonna return. Then it's going to check the next state, which is editing ID. If it is not null, if there is some value inside of editing employee, editing ID, it means that we are editing an existing one. So we're going to dispatch this action creator, editing employee. And of course, we're going to pass in the ID and name. The name is going to be the name that we've got inside our local state. And the ID is going to be the one that we've got inside of this editing ID local state. And after we dispatch this edit, we're going to set null to our editing ID. We've got our update. Now we're going to set editing ID to null. Otherwise, if this doesn't pass, it means that we are adding a new employee. So again, the same thing as the previous episode. We're going to dispatch, add employee, and then we're going to pass in the ID and name. And after all of this, we're going to set name to, an empty string. So let me take you to this component. This is exactly what we saw in the notes. Take a look at the code. You can pause the code and see what is happening here. So this part is exactly the same as before. But here we've got a new state. Here we've refactored the method, right? We've refactored the method. We want to have only one handler, right, to handle not only the process of editing a new employee, but also adding a new employee. And then the rest, handle, edit, click. This is another method that we've got for the button that we've got here. I'm going to show you the template as well. So inside of this handle, edit, click, we're going to set the name. This is the local state, as well as the editing ID. So whenever the user clicks on that edit button, we are going to set the values of our two local states. So not only the name, but also the editing ID. And you will see why we are going to do that, because as you see here, we are using this, the value of this state and the value of name state inside of this handle, add, or edit. So basically, if you take a look here, there are two buttons, right? There are two buttons here. One button is rendered for each employee. We are mapping, right? We are looping through the, let's say, the array, the employees, and for each one, we're, rendering an li. And next to the name of that employee, we are creating a button. And this button, when clicked, we're gonna, run this function. So this function basically takes this employee, the current employee inside of the map, and uses that employee to set the name and the editing ID of our states. And then there is this button. This button is responsible for both handling, editing an employee, and adding a new employee. So basically, we've got this input. The input as before is working with, the name state. But for this button, it is called handle, the handler is called handle, add, or edit. And the text inside of this button is going to be either update employee or add employee. And the condition that we check to determine whether we should render update employee or add employee is checking whether there is a value inside of editing an employee, editing an ID. So when the user clicks this button, right? When the user clicks this button, the set editing ID will get a value. And when the user updates the name and then clicks this button, because this state has a value, right? It means that we are updating. So the update will the update will be rendered as the text. And inside of this method, because again, editing ID has a value, this action will get dispatched and the current employee will get updated. But when here the user doesn't click this edit button, right? The text that you will see here will be add employee. Why? Because there is no value inside of editing ID. If you take a look at editing ID, at first when the component loads, we're going to set null to this editing ID. So at first it doesn't have any values. When it doesn't have any values, the text that you will see here is add employee. And when this button gets clicked, because again, editing ID has no value, it is null, this part will not get executed and this part will get executed and a new employee will be added based on the ID and the name, right? So the name is a state here as well. The name also is set to an empty string at the very beginning, very similar to what we've done for set editing ID. But the different thing about the name state is that it is linked to this input field. So if you take a look here, this is exactly the same thing as the previous episode. So here, as you can see, whenever the value inside of the input changes, we're going to set name to the value inside of this input. So even though set name, sets an empty string to this, prop, to this state, to this name state, the moment you enter something inside of the input, this will get some value, right? And that value will be used here to add the new employee or updating the name of an employee. Now I want to run the code and see it in action. So this is the application that we've got, right? Right off the bat, there are no employees, so I can start adding new employees. But as you can see, next to each list item that we've got here, we also get this edit button. So when we click this edit button, that state editing ID will get a value. And the name of the employee will be put here and the text of the button will change. If you take a look at the code for this edit button one more time, this, right? When you call this, handle edit click will get executed. So inside of this, not only we set the name, which is the state linked to the input that we've got here, but we also set the editing ID. So that is the reason why upon clicking this button, right, the name of that current employee got popped into this input because we are setting the name. So back to the code. Now, if I update this, if I say updated John Doe, and if I click update, the name will get updated. So inside of this update button, that was the update button, right? So editing ID had some value. Why? Because it got its value here when we clicked on this button. So now when you click this update employee, again, first the name is going to be, checked, because editing ID is not null. It has a value. It got its value here when that edit button was clicked. We're going to update the employee with the name, which we have already set here, right, upon clicking that edit button. And we are also going to pass in the editing ID, which again we set here. But when the editing ID is null, we are going to add a new employee. So let's do one more time. I'm going to say Pivus. Now I can edit either John Doe or Pivus. Whenever I click each one of these, the corresponding ID of these employees will get set inside of that, state, and the name will also get inside of that, name, and will therefore be put here. And then I can say, this is the new name. Again, there is some value inside of that editing ID. When I update, this will get updated. And of course, when this is updated, when the employee is updated, it means that this employee's array will get updated. And of course, we will see the effect inside of this UL. So let's get to the notes now. We kind of talked about the scenarios thoroughly. I don't think I need to explain this any further. So we've got the different portions, right, of this, component. Now this is kind of the summary of this episode. So we now have a component that allows us to not only add a new employee, but also edit a new employee. We are using an editing ID to track whether we are adding or editing our employee, right? And then there is a simple editing workflow using a single input field and this button that changes, its text based on the value inside of that editing ID. That's it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. If that's the case, make sure you give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one.